Hi everyone, I'm Tom Sadler. I'm a Senior Principal Software Engineer at the BBC, working on open source, inner source, industry engagement and patents. I've been working with the InnerSource Commons for coming on for about 7 years now, including serving 3 years on the board. I've also recently joined the Open UK Ambassador Programme. So today I'm going to talk about my observations of common anti-patterns in InnerSource, both from my experience at the BBC and also from speaking to people in the community. And by anti-patterns, I mean sort of common recurring mistakes and misconceptions that seem to hurt the adoption of InnerSource. So I'm going to be theming these into 4 broad categories. One is InnerSource without support. So, expecting InnerSource to be a kind of magic bullet, just saying that a project is InnerSource and expecting it to just work without any sort of changes to culture or processes or infrastructure. Incompatible culture. So where team culture sort of actively works against InnerSource, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what you can maybe do to combat that. Flawed implementation. So yeah, this one a bit more of a straightforward theme. A few examples where implementing InnerSource in a flawed way can make it more difficult to be successful. And finally, misconceptions, which are often a product of the other 3 themes. So I'm going to be referring to the InnerSource patterns. So the InnerSource patterns is an online book from the InnerSource Commons. So this has lots of common problems and solutions to those problems that the community's seen across different companies. So yeah, a lot of the times anti-patterns can be combated with patterns. So yeah, first theme, InnerSource without support. It's on GitHub, so it's already InnerSource. So weirdly, this is kind of a positive. I tend to hear this from people that are naturally very collaborative people, maybe have been involved in open source, and they don't necessarily understand the sort of confidence and knowledge gap with people that aren't comfortable with collaborative practices or open source. So in order to bring people up to speed with sort of InnerSource methodologies, you need to make sure that sort of collaboration and InnerSource is explicit. Some people feel they need permission to raise an issue or contact a team or reuse a library. So some of the patterns that can help with this: document your guiding principles, have a maturity model, and have standard-based documentation. Build it and they will come. So I've seen some teams come up with a really good idea for some tooling or some library that could have a really broad use. And we see this in open source as well. You have a really great idea, you build this really cool bit of software, and you just expect that because it is great, people will come and reuse it, implement it, contribute to it. But oftentimes, unless there is a really good understanding of what's the common problem that's being solved, that software might not actually work for as many people as you think. So the common requirements pattern is a really good way of getting around that. And also there's the visibility problem. So just because there's a really awesome project out there doesn't mean people are going to be aware of it. So implementing an InnerSource portal can help people find these great libraries, these tools that can be reused. We don't have time to maintain this, let's InnerSource it. So this one's a little bit more worrying. It's this idea that InnerSource will magically fix your problems when there's an important bit of software that needs maintaining, but there's no resource to maintain it. Some people think that InnerSource will just fix it. But from speaking to people in the community and things I've seen at work as well, this doesn't tend to work without some formal process behind it. So some patterns that you can use to alleviate this as the core team, explicit governance levels, group support, and service versus library. So the first 3 of those are all about formalizing the support model for an InnerSource project that needs maintaining but hasn't got the support. And then service versus library is a little bit different. It's still not ideal if a library isn't well maintained and well supported, but you can at least have a certain level of self-serve with a library, as opposed to a service where, yeah, a service that's running in production, like an API or a database, something like that. If there's no team behind it providing operational support, security patches, everything like that, then that will likely cause you some problems. I'm InnerSourcing my pet project. So yeah, very similar, but I suppose a different source. So if this is a Hack Week project or an individual developer has built something over the weekend that's then turned out to be really useful, again, if that's being adopted in production, but it doesn't have sort of some strong support behind it, then that can cause you some problems. So the next theme I want to talk about is incompatible culture. InnerSource won't work because people won't share credit, or what you could also think of as a zero-sum game. So weirdly, I first heard this from someone who is quite involved in open source, but in their experience, they didn't feel that that sort of open source mentality would work inside a company, because this idea of, well, if you're contributing to someone else's project, then that's just contributing to their achievements and not yours. So yeah, that kind of zero-sum game thinking, I suppose it makes sense as to why people wouldn't be motivated to do InnerSource if there is this idea that you won't get credit for contributions. So there's a couple of patterns that can alleviate that. Praise participants, so then people are getting credit, but also the review committee, which is sort of looking more at the management level, and kind of making the value within a source transparent to senior managers, so that then people are getting credit at the right level and hopefully can break down that sort of zero-sum game and uncollaborative culture. It's middle management's fault, and I think I've definitely been guilty of this. I think a lot of engineers in general have been guilty of this. But sort of looking at the middle management layer, whether that's sort of product managers or your manager's manager, and saying, well, they're stopping me from doing InnerSource. But if you really sell the value to these people, align InnerSource with the company's objectives or with their objectives and motivations, then you can make a good case for it. And yeah, much in the same way we collaborate on code, we can collaborate on delivering InnerSource. So some of the ways you can work more positively with middle managers and show them the value and get buy-in from them is the contracted contributor and the gig marketplace. So that's just a way of better tracking where developers are, so where resourcing is a concern. Cross-team project evaluation, again, is this idea of highlighting the value for managers at all levels, and review committee, as I mentioned in the previous slide. It's all about demonstrating the value. How come you have time to do InnerSource contributions? So this idea that if a team that is the maintainer of an InnerSource project, if all of a sudden they're getting a whole bunch of contributions from another team, then sometimes that team's management might be asking, well, why don't those developers work for us? We're clearly under-resourced if we need contributions, and they're clearly over-resourced if they have time to do contributions. So again, this is to do with the sales pitch of InnerSource, the education piece. Often that will be a temporary situation as well. But again, similar to the last slides, contracted contributor and gig marketplace can help make that allocation resource a bit more transparent. And trusted committer can also normalize this idea that actually, just because someone's not in your team doesn't mean they can't be regularly contributing to your code. Next theme, flawed implementation. We don't have any metrics, or we have the wrong metrics. So yeah, again, it kind of comes back to that measuring value idea. Sometimes this can be a nice place to be if you don't have the pressure to deliver any metrics to show the success of your InnerSource program. It means that there's a level of trust that InnerSource is just the right way to do things. But yeah, it's always good to understand your InnerSource activities. Think about measuring the right thing to show that your InnerSource program is going in the right direction. And yeah, there's some patterns that can help with this. Cross-team project evaluation, maturity model, and repository activity score are all some examples of some of the starting places you can go to for metrics. There's also a whole bunch of previous community calls from various people in the community on how you can get started with asking the right questions and getting the right metrics to support that. The library isn't fit for purpose. So this idea of an InnerSource project that should, in theory, solve problems for multiple people, multiple teams, but actually you get into it and it's not quite what you were looking for. So it's kind of similar to build it and they will come. So it's got similar solutions. So yeah, common requirements, really making sure that you are solving the right problem if you're building something that's supposed to be shared. And also common requirements gives potential adopters the opportunity to say, this is why we might want to adopt and contribute this library. One of the traps that you can fall into with this is what I think of as being like too dry too soon. So dry being don't repeat yourself. If you see a bit of business logic in your code, or maybe within your architecture some sort of repeatable problem to be solved, often if you make assumptions and say, well, actually we will end up repeating ourselves if we don't build this in a generic way, sometimes it's better to actually do the duplication to then identify what the actual core shared thing is, rather than building on assumptions of reusability. Try and find a real use case first. A lot of this comes down to transparency as well. So having things like an issue tracker, RFCs can help with that transparency and keep the project fit for purpose. Service versus library is another one. I suppose this is where maybe the business logic is suitable to be shared, but maybe the service pattern isn't. So whether that's how the software is deployed, differing load requirements, whatever that might be, libraries can give a bit more flexibility than having a shared service. It's in the monorepo. So this one isn't always an anti-pattern. Sometimes it can actually be a good pattern to adopt, because everything being in a monorepo can help with visibility of InnerSource projects that you can reuse and contribute to and adopt. It can help with having common standards, common release processes, which is one of the patterns I've mentioned, and maybe negates the need for an InnerSource portal if everything's already visible in monorepo. But yeah, I've heard sort of some mixed things with the monorepo. So sometimes you will get a department-specific monorepo rather than a whole company monorepo. And in that case, it actually makes it really difficult to engage with InnerSource outside of the monorepo. So although InnerSource might be easier within the monorepo, it then discourages people from looking outside, from looking at the InnerSource portal. So yeah, that's a bit of an interesting one and could be something to write up as a pattern and also anti-pattern. And finally, misconceptions. So yeah, this is kind of a product of, or can be a product of, the other anti-patterns. We're not going to do InnerSource because we don't want to go open source. So this is a misconception I've heard a few times where, yeah, you try and encourage someone to adopt InnerSource practices, but they say, oh, well, this is never going to be open source, so why would we do it? This is actually one of the more simple ones to overcome, because it's just an education piece, really. Some of the corresponding patterns to help with that is a dedicated community leader, so having a sort of inner source community leader in your company that can help with that education piece, and advocating for inner, inner source both as a potential gateway to open source, but also just as good practice for proprietary internal only software. Document your guiding principles. Again, you can say in those guiding principles explicitly that whilst it's a great on-ramp to open source, that's not always the destination. And maturity model, very similar to guiding principles. Inner source is only for developers. So again, I've got the same corresponding patterns here, but it's important that other disciplines collaborate as well. Code, especially because the ratio of staff tends to be developer heavy in most software companies. So making sure that collaboration is open for other disciplines as well is really important, whether that's shared UI components, getting your designers involved, but also people like product managers as well. Again, coming back to that anti-pattern of blaming middle managers, like helping all disciplines collaborate is really important to make inner source work, not just developers. Inner source equals abandonware. So I heard this from someone, and I suspect that that's just bad experiences of bad experiences of inner source. So where some of those other anti-patterns have been implemented, people just inner source a project and expect it to magically work, and then it ends up being abandoned. So again, having guiding principles, leadership, maturity model, explicit governance, explicit governance and group support can help prevent important inner source projects from being abandoned and unmaintained. And finally, inner source equals shared ownership. So a similar sort of thing where shared ownership isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can work really, really well. We see this in open source, where there's really sort of democratic, equal community around certain open source projects, and that can work for inner source as well. This one is maybe up for debate. I think some companies have found that kind of open and equal way of managing an inner source project can work really well. But other companies find that if everybody owns something, no one owns it. And then the project just gets abandoned because there's no leadership, no one picking up the maintenance tasks, making sure the security vulnerabilities are fixed, things like that. So again, guiding principles, maturity model, and explicit governance. And then I've put in trusted committer as well, because explicitly having trusted committers can help make shared ownership work, in my experience. So, bit of a call to action off the back of this. So, have a think about whether you've seen any of these anti-patterns yourself. Have a think, what anti-patterns have I missed? And I'd also like to explore, how do we as a community capture these anti-patterns and document them in some useful way. Maybe it's via the patterns book, or maybe there's some other material we can produce in the InnerSource Commons. And that's everything from me. Thank you very much for your time. Here's some contact details if you want to get in touch with me. So I'm on the InnerSource Commons Slack, I'm on LinkedIn, or you can contact me by email. Thank you very much.